Hi everyone, and welcome to today's broadcast. This presentation is being brought to you by the Resilient Power Project. That project is run by the Clean Energy Group. Our topic today is the economics of grid defection. And to begin with, I'd like to go over a quick housekeeping slide. All of our participants today are in listen-only mode, which means that you can hear us, but we can't hear you. We recommend that you listen in using your computer's mic and speakers to avoid toll charges, but you can also listen in for audio via your telephone. Throughout the broadcast, we encourage you to submit questions into the question box on your console. We will answer all questions at the end as we have time in a Q&A session with our panelists. So throughout the broadcast, please remember to submit your questions. This webinar is being recorded and will be available on our website at the address you see on your screen. And with that, I'd like to introduce Todd Olinsky. Todd is the project director for the Resilient Power Project, and he's going to introduce today's guest speakers and talk a little bit about our webinar today. Todd, go ahead.
Okay, thank you very much. And if you could just advance the slides, that would be terrific. So yes, I want to say a little bit about our project and introduce the speakers here. Samantha, can we get a slide? There we go. Just back up one. So Clean Energy Group is a nonprofit, and we are presenting this webinar under the auspices of our Resilient Power Project, which is foundation funded, and just to briefly orient everybody, this was a project that started after Hurricane Sandy devastated many communities in the Northeast, and a number of states that we work with came to us and said, you know, we really need to start working on resilient power before the next storm comes along. And so we started this project working with the northeastern states as a core group, and now we're about to begin expanding that out to the rest of the country and also down to the level of municipalities, since that's where most of the real work of deploying resilient power happens. So basically we're here to help states and municipalities to implement clean resilient power solutions. In other words, not more diesel generators, but solutions that employ clean, renewable, and high efficiency generation and energy storage. And we are also looking at not only just helping with technology, but also public financing tools, policy tools, engaging federal resources as well as state and municipal resources, and also looking at how to get these solutions into low-income and vulnerable communities that are often impacted more severely than other communities in these disasters. Next slide, please. So I think that's our introduction, and I'd like to go ahead and introduce the three speakers we have from Rocky Mountain Institute. We have Bodhi Rader, an associate who works primarily in RMI's electricity practice, though he also works on efficient buildings and networks as well in the RMI buildings practice. In his electricity work, he focuses on the disruptive potential of new technology, business models, and the evolution of the interconnected smart grid, cybersecurity, and distributed renewables. He's the lead analyst and modeler for the Grid Defection report, which is going to be the subject of this presentation, and also an upcoming follow-on report that will be discussed as well today. We also have Leah Guccione, who is a manager with RMI. She works in the electricity and industrial practices area. Prior to joining RMI, she served as a nuclear-trained surface warfare officer in the United States Navy, and she now leverages her experience as a power plant supervisor to help transform U.S. and global energy systems into dynamic networks that are more renewable and more reliable. We're also pleased to have James Mandel, manager at RMI's electricity practice, where he focuses on disruptive and emerging technologies, and he's also an author on the Grid Defection report. So We're about to start the main presentation. Before I hand it over to Bodhi, Leah, and James, I want to reiterate that we are going to have time at the end for questions and discussion. This is often the most interesting and valuable part of these webinars, is addressing questions from participants. It will really help if you would enter those questions as they occur to you during the presentation by typing them into the question box on your screen. Don't wait till the end to submit those questions, and I'll do my best to get those in some kind of order so that we can try to address as many as possible and in a way that makes sense. Okay, I think we're ready to hand it over to Bodhi to begin the presentation.
Thank you, Todd, and thanks to everyone for joining us today on this Tuesday. We're really pleased to have you and discuss the Economics of Grid Defection report that we released this past February. I'll begin by just giving a brief introduction to the Rocky Mountain Institute and then speak about the report, how we structured it, and the results that we came up with. So for those of you that have already read the report, we appreciate your interest and support. Much of the initial portion of our presentation will be a good review of our major findings. And for those of you that haven't read it, hopefully this will whet your appetite to download the full copy, which is available at rmi.org/electricity_grid_defection. Again, that's rmi.org/electricity-grid defection with an underscore between those last three words. And again, we'll be discussing our ongoing research at the end, which is a follow-on to this report due out later this year. That sort of answers the so what question in terms of how should utilities and regulators, financiers, independent third parties respond to the results. So let me just go ahead and dive in by discussing what the Rocky Mountain Institute does and how this falls into our work. So we are call ourselves a think and do tank founded about 30 years ago by Amory Levins, and we focus on creating a clean, prosperous, and secure energy future. We tend to stay out of the political arena and instead focus on market-based solutions by working with businesses, communities, and institutions to actually implement solutions to transform global energy use. A few years back, we released a book entitled Reinventing Fire, and it describes how we can shift to a much more prosperous U.S. economy by transforming how we use energy through more renewables and efficiency in the electric, buildings, transportation, and industrial sectors. And that sort of outlines the work that we do today. So on the next slide here, you see our 2025 goals, which roughly follows that breakout along those four sectors. And right now we're focusing mostly on transforming the electric sector, introducing super efficient buildings, and working with communities to transform their energy use. And we also have a Reinventing Fire China project in which we're working with them to create a new energy plan for their future. So the topic of our presentation today falls under our Electricity Disruptor program, and if you have any more questions about how our work falls into these areas or our goals in these areas, please feel free to ask us later on. But I'd like to just go ahead and dive into our study, and I'll start by giving you an overview and our motivations for creating this work, highlight the major results, dive into a few areas in more detail that we frequently get questions on and are interesting touch points for this research, and then I'll hand it over to Leah for our ongoing research and what you can expect in our follow-on report. So to begin, why did we even choose to undergo this study, and how did we put it together? Many of you are probably familiar with the Disruptive Challenges report released by the Edison Electric Institute last year. But even if not, I'm sure you've come across articles, papers, or just heard in the news about the so-called utility death spiral. And all of that talk and potential for this to possibly occur caused us to think about answering a more detailed question and trying to pinpoint when and where specifically a solar and battery storage system might compete with traditional utility service. So as we move to the next slide here, basically we're exploring the far end of a new customer spectrum in their relationship with electric service. So the very last part is where we focused our first report. What if a customer installs solar and storage at their home or business and decides to defect from the grid completely? So to undergo this study, we looked at 5 different locations that you'll see on the slide in front of you. And we looked at each of these 5 locations to get a representative set of conditions that might influence when parity happens. So one of those factors being, of course, the solar insolation level at that location. So each of these has a variety of solar potential. But even more importantly is the local retail electric price. And you can see how much it varies in these locations we chose. And that will be a key factor in determining when our parity point happens. And then finally, we also took note of how much PV is already installed in these locations. You can think of it as a proxy to perhaps the potential for further installations of these systems, or how friendly the market might be to distributed generation. So with these 5 locations in mind, we actually implemented 4 different scenarios in our study. And these I'll go into a bit more detail because it really drove our results, and I think it's important to just understand how these all interconnect. So we started off with a base case scenario, and we looked at both a residential and commercial customer for each of those 5 locations I just discussed. Our residential is fairly straightforward, a single-family home, while the commercial customer, we used a load profile of a small hotel, so a fairly small commercial customer. In the base case, we assumed current trajectories, current projections for cost declines in our PV and battery systems. We also assumed stable load dynamics, and that will make more sense when I describe our demand side improvement scenario, and meeting 100% of that load in a typical day in a typical year. And from that scenario was kind of our starting point. We jumped into 2 more aggressive scenarios, the first being our accelerated technology improvement scenario. So here we simply took those cost projections for our technology, the battery and PV systems, and assumed aggressive cost declines to 2020. So starting today through 2020, we assumed that we would meet the PV sunshot goals at the Department of Energy program, as well as the Department of Energy battery goal for lithium-ion batteries by 2020. And you see the prices listed on the screen there. The PV, those are installed PV prices, and then that battery is at per kilowatt hour price. And reaching those prices, like I said, by 2020, and then being held steady through 2050. In our demand side improvement case, I'll just ask you to back up a step to starting again with our base case and not assuming any aggressive cost declines, but instead installing a full complement of efficiency measures. So this permanently reduces our demand on the residential and commercial side by 30% and 34% respectively. And then on our residential side, we introduced a 2% load management scenario, if you will. So basically, roughly 168 hours out of the year, that customer would have to think about when they want to use their energy. So maybe that means washing dishes by hand or vacuuming when there's a better solar resource potential. On our commercial side, we assume that that wouldn't be something those customers would be willing to do, so we didn't include any such measure. I should also mention that on our commercial side, we did allow for the use of a diesel generator backup system, and we'll talk about that a little bit more, but we also figured many of these commercial customers already use that as a backup, so we want to model that as well. So again, now we've covered the accelerate technology and demand side improvement scenarios, and so for a final scenario, which we called our combined improvement scenario, as the name suggests, we combined both of those measures into one and created our most aggressive scenario. And you'll see how important these results are as I describe what we found when we input those figures into our model. So speaking of the model, this graphic here roughly portrays how we put all this information together. We started with cost projections. We found a few different studies from Bloomberg, Energy Information Administration, a variety of others on cost projections for our PV, our batteries. We did some assumptions on diesel fuel prices, input those into our model. We took the two load profiles, and those are based off of publicly available data on the National Renewable Energy Laboratory website. We input some specifications on how these systems will operate. And then we also assume two financial assumptions, the investment tax credit and also on the commercial side only the maker's credit for those customers for accelerated depreciation. So we input all those figures, those data into Homer Energy modeling software, and Homer Energy was one of our partners on this report. It's a tool that was developed initially by the National Renewable Energy Laboratory and is now a standalone product that models microgrid systems, but was a perfect tool to use in this report. And it basically optimizes all these factors to come up with the cheapest cost solution to meet your load, and gives you a whole host of other helpful information, some of which you see on the slide there. We'll be focusing mostly on the levelized cost of energy, but we'll also talk a little bit about emissions factors in a couple of slides. So now that we've covered how we put our study together, I'd just like to highlight a few of the results. But actually, before I do, I'd like to just pose a question to our audience just as you think about our work, and ask you to think about, have you seen any of these factors already occurring in the places you live and work, and how that's influencing the electric system? And you don't have to provide us an answer. I'd just like to throw these out as a thought piece to perhaps engage in a conversation later on. So let's move on to the results. And I'll start off with our commercial results. And this is in our base case. And you'll remember this is the least aggressive scenario. And you notice that in all 5 of our locations, we reached that parity point before 2050. The dashed lines represent our retail electric price. And what we've done here is assume the 3% price increase per year for each location. So when the two colored matching lines intersect, that's when we stated it's a parity point. The 3% increase is actually proving to be fairly conservative in some locations. And if you assume some of those aggressive scenarios which I described, you can pull forward that parity point by almost 10 years, and you'll see that in a little bit more detail in a couple of slides. And here are the results for the residential scenario, exact same format. You'll notice the data isn't as dramatic, but the 3 locations, Honolulu, Los Angeles, and Westchester, do reach parity before 2050 in our base case. And the same applies. Introducing demand management or efficiency measures, or even the aggressive cost declines, could bring the parity forward by about 10 years. So our next slide is a little bit busy, but I'll walk you through it. This basically shows the results for all of the scenarios for all of our locations, and this is in the commercial customer case. So each of the colors represents one of our locations, and then the 2 or 3 letter acronym represents our 4 different cases. And you'll notice here that, like I mentioned before, all scenarios in all cases reach parity by 2050, but perhaps more interestingly is that grid parity is already here for all scenarios in Honolulu today. Parity is reached for our combined improvement scenarios before 2030 in all of our locations. And again, as I mentioned, this does include the use of a diesel generator, but the results are pretty startling nonetheless. We didn't necessarily expect this sort of parity point to happen when we initiated our study. Doing the same on our residential parity timeline, you'll see again it's not quite as dramatic, but I'll highlight a few main points. That the combined improvement scenario reaches parity by 2020 in Honolulu, Los Angeles, and Westchester. Again, those are our 3 most high-priced locations. And then all scenarios for Honolulu reach parity by 2022. And then introducing only that demand side, which is the efficiency and load management profile, Honolulu, Los Angeles, and Westchester all reach parity prior to 2030. Now, I'd like to show these results in a slightly different fashion in looking at the impact on customers and revenue. Specifically here, we're looking in the year 2024 in the Southwest. What these bars represent is basically a decile breakdown of customers in the Southwest region, and you'll see at the bottom of your slide the states that we considered to be part of the Southwest for the purposes of this chart. So in essence, to read it, if you want to reach 20% of customers, you'd have to cross those first two bars. So plotting our base case scenario onto this chart, you'll see that 20% of customers reach parity with our base case in 2024. This is roughly 800,000 customers and over $6 billion in revenue. Introducing the demand-side improvement case, we reach nearly half of our customers, so around 1.7 million customers could be affected in the Southwest. The accelerated technology improvement scenario jumps us forward to roughly 70% of customers, and then if the scenario of the combined improvement case comes to fruition, every single customer reaches parity, which is well over $16 billion in revenue. Doing the same on our residential side, again, as you might expect, the results aren't as dramatic. So in our base case scenario, we're well off from reaching any of the customers in the Southwest. Similarly, with the demand side and accelerated technology improvement scenarios, we're getting really close. But in the combined improvement scenario, we reach about 20 million customers and $23 billion in revenue. I think it's about 90% of the customers in the Southwest. So again, I just wanted to pose one more somewhat rhetorical question. Do you find these results startling, and what would this mean for your own business, or perhaps your own thoughts on owning a system of this type, or the financing involved? So I didn't give you very much time to think about that one, but I'll continue on and talk about a few areas in more detail, specifically the case of our diesel genset. And as Todd mentioned earlier, the focus of the Clean Energy Group is more on renewable sources of generation. And so we do, understand the viewpoint of, well, are we recommending everyone to install a diesel generator? And that's not necessarily the case. We've actually, in our model, limit limited the use of the generator to no more than 25% of the load, and you'll see that it rarely even reaches anywhere close to that. So here again, we're looking at Los Angeles, and you notice in 2024 it's well under 8.7% in each of our 4 scenarios, and as time goes on, as we move through to 2050, that diesel genset gets used even less because of the cost declines in PV and battery systems. The other important thing to note in this graphic is it just cleanly displays how our different scenarios work together. So you see there on the right side the residential case introducing the efficiency measures and demand management on the demand side improvement and combined improvement scenarios. Another point that I'd like to make that's been really interesting to us is the effect of demand side improvements. In many cases, installing efficiency measures is not only the easiest but also the cheapest thing to do in reducing your load, and we noticed a very dramatic shift in what the systems, these off-grid systems, might look like for a residential customer. So I'll draw your attention to the chart on the bottom left, and you'll see that well over a half, in many cases a 3/4 reduction in the needed battery size, which is typically the most costly component for each of our customers, and then how that impacts the capital costs for the systems. It lowers it by roughly half. And then in my final slide, just want to take a moment, and I'll ask Leah and Jamie to chime in here on the financing, the importance of low-cost financing. So in our base case scenarios, we assumed a fairly aggressive decline in interest rates from 9.5% down to, I believe it was 4.4 and 4.6%. And you'll notice on the chart on the left that parity point for Westchester, this is a commercial case, at 2025. The dotted line represents the parity point without a diesel generator, and you'll see that it's roughly 10 years later. But what's interesting is if you hold the cost of capital steady at 9.5% instead of bringing it down to that 4% level, it delays parity by about 7 years. So this is an important area that we're starting to engage more work in terms of getting that cost of capital down and making it more attractive for lenders to invest in these systems. Anything you guys want to add?
Yeah, this is Jamie Mandel. I mean, I would just sort of emphasize the point that when we talk about these systems, they're capital intensive and relatively lighter on the O&M side, and so you'd imagine ownership models, or we would at least, that are similar to PPAs or operating leases that you see in the solar space today, as opposed to fully owned systems. And this is, I think, one of the key themes we've seen with early adopters in Hawaii and also in battery systems in California today, is that folks choose to manage the complexity through investing in a financed third-party system, and so cost of capital becomes quite important. And in solar, we've seen a pretty steady decline in cost of capital over time, and we're hoping to get that much lower through the advent of securitization. You can imagine in these systems where the battery technology is much newer, the cost of capital, again, investors are going to need to sort of vet their understanding, and there might be a risk premium in the very early days. However, the systems we've seen have a cost of capital similar to solar today, which is on the higher side, I guess, if we're compared to other consumer financing.
Great, thanks so much, Jamie. So before I hand off to our ongoing research and what we're looking to do in our second report, I'll just wrap up the key messages that we've uncovered through this report and that I've touched on through the slides we've just shared with you. And that is that the grid parity and defection risk exists for not only residential but also commercial customers, and it enables greater customer empowerment. And this defection risk arrives for the majority of customers in the locations we studied within that 30-year planning horizon and economic horizon of most utility assets. However, I do want to point out that we're not stating that parity means defection. I mean, there's a lot of factors that would go into a customer actually choosing to leave the grid and install one of these systems. They'd have to want to manage their own energy more and have access to the equipment needed, and work with utility to be able to do so. And we actually found that defection is a suboptimal solution. Many of these systems are grossly oversized to meet that little bit of peak demand, which is why the demand management or the efficiency scenarios really make a big difference. And defection isn't necessarily available to every customer. There are those that won't have the space to install these systems nor the financial means. So that's an area that we're looking at a little bit more closely in our second report in terms of how can these systems work together with the grid. And that leads me to the final point, which is that the speed of this disruption is happening faster than I think most realize, and utilities and regulators need to adopt new business models and regulations to counter this change or this possibility. And we have probably less than 10 years to do so, because as you've seen, more and more customers are starting to enter this phase where they could economically do this if they so wanted. And with that, I'll hand it over to Leah to discuss our ongoing research.
Thanks, Bertie.
Okay, thanks. Before we go into the ongoing research, I just wanted to, if it's okay with the presenters, jump in. There's a couple of questions on the material you've presented already, so it might make sense to take those now, if that's okay with the folks from RMI.
That's fine. We'd be happy to take a few questions now before we get into our next bit of research.
Okay, great. Well, I'm going to kick it off with one observation that I had, which I think some folks might be surprised that the relative insulation, that is the amount of sun basically that you would expect to get in a particular area, isn't driving these results. As far as I can tell from looking at your report, it looks like other things like the cost of electricity, for example, are much more important variables when you see something like Westchester coming out sort of at grid parity ahead of other places that may actually have a better solar resource. Can you speak briefly to, what were the primary variables in determining this grid parity point?
Todd, we can certainly speak to that. And this is something that was a bit of a notable realization to us when we did our analysis, was that because we treated the costs of the solar PV and the batteries as perfectly liquid, in that a solar panel costs the same in Texas as it does in California as it does in Hawaii. The actual cost of the system is pretty similar between the regions. And what's interesting is if you look at, take for example, our commercial results, you'll notice that the levelized cost of the system in California is nearly identical to the levelized cost of the system in Texas. And so what really drives the difference in the parity timeline between those two geographies is that cost of retail electric service. California, because of the way the state has regulated their utilities, because of the population density in certain parts of the state and a number of other factors, has higher electricity rates than Texas does. And that dramatically impacts the parity timeline between those two states by almost 16 years. So the big factor is that cost of retail service And then to some extent, what we call the necessary days of autonomy. And this has to do with the weather pattern, most oftenly in the winter, which is how many days do you need to be able to survive with just the battery only. And that's normally dictated by winter month cloud cover, so how many days of cloudiness in a row. And so that is what will cause a big distinction between the cost of the system in a place like New York and the cost of the system in California, where you don't have as many necessary days of autonomy. So those are some of the big variables that drive these cost differences and then thus the timeline differences.
Okay, great. Thank you. We had a couple of questions that I thought we could quickly answer before moving on. Somebody wants to know, do these parity projections include all financial incentives in each of the regions? And by that, I'm assuming they mean various state programs.
That's a great question. And actually, as a conservatism, we only considered the federal level incentives for these systems. So that would be for the commercial systems, the investment tax credit and the accelerated depreciation. And then for residential systems, the residential renewable energy credit, which sometimes people refer to as the residential ITC. There's so many different state-level incentives programs, and how they apply to systems that include storage is often up to interpretation. We elected not to consider them at all. And so in several cases, those credits, like the self-generation incentive program in California, for example, are quite substantial and will reduce the costs of these systems by almost half. And so when you think about some of those specific local incentive programs, the parity timeline becomes much more aggressive.
Okay, great. And then we have another participant who wants to know how the projected costs of retail electricity were developed for the report. And if I recall correctly, I think you said you were looking at using a 3% increase for the model. But I guess the question is, how was that arrived at?
Sure. This is Jamie Mandel again. We started with retail electricity prices for each of the regions today, and for that we just used a database called Genability, which can give you for a typical load profile the retail electricity rate you'd see today. And so, for commercial, the rough equivalent of the load profile we modeled is you might think of a 4-story hotel as an example, and at the residential it was just the median household customer for the residential load profile. We then looked back several years at what the rate of change in those electricity prices were, and we found an average of between 2.7 and 2.9% increase in the real rate of a real 2.7 to 2.9% real increase in the rate of electricity prices over time. And that 2.9% gave us a basis for the 3% projection we used. So we then projected forward with that 3% per year increase.
Okay, thank you. I want to go ahead and move into the next part of the presentation, which is I understand you're going to be talking about the next step in terms of following this report with additional research. I just want to remind people we're going to have time for more questions and discussion at the end. Please send in your questions. We have 66 attendees right now, and only one outstanding question that we have to discuss later. So send them in if you got them. Okay. Please go ahead with the next part of the presentation.
Great. Thanks, Todd. So as Bodhi referenced earlier, here at RMI, we've really recognized that the spectrum of options for consumers to meet their electricity needs has really changed and diversified in the last 10 to 15 years. And that's largely due to the emergence of affordable distributed energy solutions. Prior to the last 10 or 15 years, solar PV was something that was very much reserved for remote applications where there was really no other option to provide power. But now that the costs of these technologies have come down, this is really giving the majority of customers new options to meet their electricity needs. And so while this totally off-grid customer might be the most radical occurrence that you see on this spectrum, the thing that we actually think is going to be most disruptive is the customer who has distributed solar and distributed storage but wants to remain connected to the grid. And so this really, from our first report, brought to light a number of questions like, is grid defection really an optimal choice? What can utilities of all varieties do to stabilize their business model? Because this is something that's very challenging in terms of how they're currently regulated to provide electric service and recover their costs to do so. And then what, in this new era of the prosumer, as many people like to refer to it, what are the new ways that people are going to want to interact with the grid and transact with the grid? And what kind of system capabilities and rules will that really necessitate? So when you think about the value of distributed resources and how they can be integrated into the grid, the reality is that these two things can be complementary in that having greater distributed solar and greater levels of distributed storage on the grid can provide both benefits to the grid and benefits to the customers. And we know that there is this synergy. Most of the questions and thus the sort of challenge and opportunity is figuring out how can we balance these and share these values and incentivize them for all the stakeholders that are on the system. So something that we're exploring in our current research now is what is the opportunity to maximize all of the different values that solar and batteries can bring to a distributed energy future. And part of what makes this challenging is when you think about what the values of distributed solar are and what the values and benefits of distributed energy storage are, there's a lot of them. It's pretty easy to make the list that you see here on this slide. The reality is, though, and therein lies the complexity, is that while we can point to these values as something that we know can benefit our system and needs to happen, not all of these can actually be properly monetized. And you can't put a dollar value and say that you're specifically paying for one thing or receiving a benefit for one thing. And so one of the challenges is trying to find ways that we can capture all of these values and monetize them so that people are properly incentivized to build these systems in a way that adds maximum benefit to the customer and to the grid as a whole. So today we know, and to that point, we see a lot of different actors who are playing in this space right now and are offering distributed solar in combination with storage, and in some cases just offering distributed storage by itself. And each of these different companies and utilities is building their product offering based on a different set of values. For example, Green Charge Networks is a solution provider that's pretty active in California, and they provide distributed storage and in some cases combine that with distributed PV. But their entire value proposition to their customers is built on demand charge reductions for that customer. And that's how they're able to provide the return on investment for those systems. Whereas if you look at Solar Grid Storage, which is a company that's very active on the East Coast, particularly in the PJM market, their entire product offering is really dependent on participation in frequency regulation markets, where they use the battery that's part of the system to help provide better power quality and frequency response to the local grid. And that, the way they're able to receive payments for that service is what allows them to offer the return on investment that they are. And so those are sort of two examples of how those companies are building their business case on one specific set of values or a combination of values. But what we haven't seen yet are folks who are really able to build a system that really captures all of those values. And that's one of the challenges that we're looking at and starting to explore in our next report. But something that's important to keep in mind is that all of these business models are heavily dependent on the declining costs of battery energy storage. And these are the battery energy cost numbers that we looked at and considered for our report, and know that the industry needs to keep driving them down. And companies like Tesla and others are doing great things in terms of improving their manufacturing processes and integrating their supply chains, like Tesla is looking to do with their Gigafactory. And that's one thing that will drive costs down. But we also know here at RMI from some of our work in the solar industry is that the actual cost of the hardware is only part of the total installed cost for a distributed storage system. And we're actually kicking off some research here at the Institute that's looking at what we call the balance of systems costs for battery and distributed storage systems. And these are the costs beyond the cell or the battery pack that look at what is the cost of the interconnection process, what is the cost of labor and installation, what is the cost of capital, and how does that affect the total installed cost of the system, and how can we start to bring those down? Because bringing down those costs are what are going to help these current players in the solar battery industry continue to prosper, but then also allow for new actors and then new customers to be able to find values with these systems. So that's where we're going with our current research at the Institute, and we're happy to take any more questions that anyone might have.
Okay, thank you very much. Again, we have a couple of questions, and there's room for more. So if you've been listening and you have a question or comment, please type it into the question box on your screen, and we will get to as many as we can. You know, one of the things that I was thinking about in terms of this spectrum that you showed earlier on of possible, I guess, customer types. You know, the person that wants to be totally off the grid, the person that wants to have some independence but still be grid connected, and so forth. It seemed to me that if I were investing in new technology, and as a consumer, I'm thinking, okay, you know, maybe I've never had solar, probably never had, you know, this type of battery technology before. I'd probably want to keep that grid connection just as a fail-safe and sort of a backup in case it doesn't work out the way that it's advertised to work out. And so I'm wondering, and of course that's sort of one of the basis of all these utility death spiral projections that you hear about, is that in order to maintain the backup power for those grid-connected customers that are no longer buying much power, but they want to keep that connection, that the utilities may be tempted to raise those standby charges to the point where they'll drive people off the grid. I guess my question is, you know, assuming that that's a likely scenario, that people are going to want to maintain those grid connections and have the benefit of a solar storage system, so that their actual grid power purchases decrease significantly. How are utilities going to be able to maintain the generation capacity to cover all those customers in case their systems fail, at the same time not, you know, at the same time selling a vastly reduced amount of power? Maybe that's something that you can't answer until you do the next report.
Well, Todd, it's a really tough question, and that's something that not only our project team at the Institute is working on, but some of our other colleagues. We actually have a team as part of our Electricity Innovation Lab that's really actively working with the New York Public Service Commission to explore many issues, but this is one of them. And that's also part of what our Electricity Innovation Lab is really looking to do. The E-Lab, as we like to call it in short, is an ongoing collaboration of key leaders and stakeholders from across the electricity system, including regulators, utilities, financiers, solutions providers and technology providers, as well as other sort of regulatory experts. And the tough question is we have to figure out a way to find the value in these systems and move our grid to a much more sustainable, reliable system while not breaking it in the process. And some of this is going to require us to fundamentally rethink the way that we measure reliability on the system. And right now, utilities are expected to provide reliability and power quality consistent with the standards that are set by the North American Electric Reliability Council, NERC. And there's a very prescriptive calculation that they're evaluated against. One of the things we consider here is that there are probably other ways that you could provide reliability that don't fit neatly into those sort of prescriptive calculations, but still ultimately get you the same nines of reliability per se. And so thinking about how a network of microgrids or a system that is flush with distributed home energy systems that include solar and battery and other capabilities, how those can be leveraged, controlled, and coordinated to provide reliability. That's something that the system needs to work towards, and we're actively thinking about how you might create the right incentive structures and cues to do those things. I want to pass it over to Jamie, who I know has something to add here.
Thanks, Leah. I just wanted to make kind of one additional point to highlight there, which is, to me, the really big unanswered question is whether these distributed investments benefit the system as a whole or are just benefiting the customer. Because I think, underlying the question is, if folks make investments that are fundamentally improving personal economics at the expense of the system, I think there's dangerous consequences to system economics for that. And then, I think it's one of our fundamental beliefs, but really an unanswered quantitative question at scale, is whether these systems can be used in a way that consistently lowers costs or improves service at the system level. And if that's the case, then I think it's important, the next question becomes a constructive one, right? How do you help evolve the pricing mechanisms or other sort of contracts and relationships in order to provide that relationship in a way that is that incents personal investment while lowering system costs. So it doesn't need to be an either or, but I think there does need to be some really rigorous research around how these systems are used and then where costs and benefits accrue, whether it's at the personal level or the system level.
And I just want to throw in one quick comment to add to that. And Todd, you really hit on the biggest question that's out there, and I think there may not be a clean answer until someone comes up with that solution that starts to become emulated by others. So, for instance, a company like NRG is really thinking about this issue and how both grid, centralized generation, and distributed generation can work together and how they can profit from that as a company. So that business model evolution might be the answer that then drives us towards this new future. So if you can imagine the Apple of energy service providers coming up with that solution that everyone wants, you drive towards that change, which I think will just cascade and become the new norm.
Thank you. It's certainly, it's going to be interesting to watch. I'm sort of thinking that this is going to happen potentially very differently in different areas of the country, based on, you know, the differences in the way that grid operators run their grids and the way that various utilities respond to the changing markets, and as well as the basic realities of, as you've laid out here, the differences in electricity costs and so forth. There's a question from a participant. Are there breakthroughs either in PV module efficiency and or battery chemistry that could transform the market more quickly, or is it simply a matter of driving down costs through economies of scale, which is what this current report seems to focus on?
Yeah, I'll touch on that. I think that's a very real possibility that we haven't seen the end of the battery storage evolution cycle, and something that none of us are aware of yet may emerge that completely changes the picture. Right now, you know, everyone's looking towards these cost reductions, and Leah mentioned the Tesla Gigafactory. I think that'll be a big boom that may change the picture if that does come online. But we've already seen that many of the projections that we're using in our base case are too conservative for what's actually happening out there. So we've already seen that we're reaching those PV sunshot goals, and the battery innovations are happening quicker than you know, initial projections estimated. So we're getting towards that aggressive technology scenario where the prices are much lower than possible. But like the person asking the question mentioned, I think it's a very real possibility that there's a battery startup out there that's just going to, you know, change the landscape completely. So we've talked with companies like Ambri and Aquion that are just trying wholly new chemistries that could, you know, change this conversation. And like I alluded to just a second ago, another thing that might change the entire picture regardless of price is, you know, if that Apple of energy service comes out. Right now, many of us are carrying a phone in our pocket that years ago we never thought we even needed. It's much more expensive than the phone service we had before, but yet we all need one. We have to have one. So I think it's possible that the right combination of financing and installation and access and ease of access comes together, where now you have this trend that everyone just has to have one of these systems, and the cost will be less of an issue because of the convenience it brings, the cool factor it brings, or the just, you know, new style of living, the innovation that everyone wants comes to bear.
But when you look at your upcoming report, which is, as I understand it, going to focus on a segment of people that might want to have solar plus storage but also still be tied to the grid, it seems as though resiliency as a benefit or a service that that system can provide is going to be very important. I mean, if it weren't for the resiliency benefit, then you could as easily just have the PV without the battery and net meter. I'd sort of use the grid as a storage device, essentially. But with the addition of the battery and the ability to island your system in case the grid goes down, you gain this extra resiliency benefit. When you're doing this analysis, what price do you put on that? How do you, and this is a question that seems to be current right now for a lot of states that are wrestling with this when they're putting together their programs for microgrids or their programs for resilient power or energy storage. How do you value resiliency and put that into your calculations?
Todd, that's a great question. And to be honest, we don't actually prescribe a value to reliability or resiliency in our calculus. And this is something that we agree is pretty intractable question for a lot of people across the industry. And what we see for those people who are considering these microgrids and distributed hybrid systems, right now they really only fall into two camps, and those camps are kind of at the opposite end of the spectrum. And the one camp values reliability so much that they don't even need to put a price on it to invest in these systems. We see that a lot with universities and research facilities, that it's such a no-brainer that they don't even take the time to try and put $1 per kilowatt or $1 per kilowatt hour value on it. And then the other camp are the people where it's not enough of an issue for them to have ever made the effort to try and prescribe a value to it. And so what I think, and this is something that we are seeing emerge in our conversations with regulators and others, is that we do need to kind of create, and so what has, I should back up a second, what has resulted is that there's really a deficit of methodological approaches to valuing reliability. There's actually not that much guidance on how you could and should do this, and that's leaving a lot of decision makers in a tough spot to consider the real value add of increased reliability that these systems offer. You know, a great example is we've worked with some of the engineers both at NREL and for the Marine Corps that did some of the valuation and modeling studies for the microgrid that they're looking to build at the Miramar Air Station. And when you ask them, so in their study they assigned, I believe, a $25 kilowatt hour price to, or megawatt hour price to reliability. And when you ask them where they got it, they pretty much just made it up. There's not a lot of rigorous methodology that went behind that specific number, but when you look at the results, being able to put a dollar value on it actually made a very significant difference in justifying the added costs of the microgrid. So we think that this is an important area of research and is something that we're looking to kind of continue to iterate on here at the Institute, not necessarily specifically with our solar battery research, but in some of our other fields of work. Jamie, Bodhi, do you guys have anything you would want to add there?
Yeah, I'll just say that preliminarily in our results, we're seeing that there clearly is a value to being still connected to the grid. It may not be as much as we thought. I mean, we're seeing that systems that provide half or 75% or even 90% of the electricity on their own, with the grid providing the rest, are almost equal in price or at the point when they reach parity, and that's much earlier than the parity points we've shown today. But those differences, there's a change in value in what the customer has to spend to install that system, and what perhaps the utility gains by not losing a customer, if I can put it that way. And so there's you can think of it as a wedge of value there between when a customer might reach parity and decide to leave the grid versus, hey, let's stay connected to the grid and work together. And so we're starting to see some, qualitative results on what that value might look like and what could be shared. The difficult part is, what cost do you assign to each party there? Does the customer get most of it? Does the utility get most of it? Does the installer get most of it? And I think, like you mentioned, it's going to depend on the area, the needs of that grid in the area, and how regulations evolve over time.
Okay, thank you. I want to just close this out with one final question from a participant. And Samantha, I don't know if we have a slide that has our CEG URL where people can get this. There you go. Thank you. I want to reiterate that this this is being recorded as we record all our webinars, and they're available on our website for review later, or if you know somebody who couldn't make it to this broadcast, they can go and take a look at it. It should be posted within a day or two. So final question from one of the participants: how will the expiration or reduction of federal tax credits in 2016 impact the DG and/or solar marketplace?
Yeah, this is Jamie Mandel again. So we modeled that explicitly in part one. We had those incentives expiring in 2016 and did not assume an extension. I think one of the things you see that we find pretty exciting is that if you lay the expiration of those incentives against the drop in cost of capital that we would project, and a lot of studies are showing, they can roughly cancel each other out. And so as costs of capital decline, it does provide an opportunity to overcome some of the, basically cancel out and even make up, and then some of the incentive that is lost in 2016. So I think for us, when we look at those expiration of incentives, and our basic change model is to try to identify business-based solutions for the technologies as opposed to advocate for additional incentives or extensions. And so for us, the solution seems to be to try to race to unlock capital markets through, A, better understanding of risk profiles for these technologies, and B, creating more finance options. And I think the biggest and most exciting development in the solar space right now is the emergence of securitization and yield codes and other tradable finance options that can dramatically lower cost of capital. Again, I think if you have that and there was an extension of incentives, or when you layer in things like local incentives, as an earlier questioner asked, economics would improve quite dramatically.
Okay, well, this is all very exciting, and it's an excellent report. I want to recommend it to everybody. It's the Economics of Grid Defection. It's available at the Rocky Mountain Institute website, and I want to thank Bodhi Rader, Leah Guccione, and James Mandel from Rocky Mountain Institute for this presentation. Again, it will be available in its entirety with audio and the slides on our website. You can see on the screen www.cleanegroup.org. Go to the Resilient Power Project page, and there will be links to this webinar and other webinars. So I think with that we will end. Thanks again to our panelists.